So my name's Thomas Maguire. I'm an architectural photographer. Professionally, I do property and interior photography, while in my free time I do fine arts architecture photography. The project that I've done for the exhibition is a black and white fine art photography series. It's a series of images set in London. The name of the exhibition is called Metropolis, focusing on luminosity, sort of the theming of light and how that changes a building. The way I sort of shoot these structures, I try and sort of make it look like they're sort of like their own sort of living being almost. They're not something that should be inhabited. They've become their own sort of artistic caricature. Yeah, this project's more art-based. Obviously, it sort of delves into like what fine art photography is. And it's quite, particularly the last couple of years, it's sort of become quite, sort of relatively sort of common. A lot of people have been doing sort of fine art, architecture, and their sort of own interpretation of what it's meant to represent. I first started doing it this was probably back in like 2015, 2016 when I first started doing it. And then it was only really in the past like year or two that I've gone back into it sort of thing. And obviously since then I've learned a lot of new skills in how to perfect an image, particularly when it comes to post-production, which is obviously the more tricky part. You know, most people think it's editing an image, just, you know, boosting the contrast and the black and whites, but it's a lot more that goes into it, really. It all comes down to the post-production. But yeah, it's a fine arts photography project, so you're seeing buildings as you wouldn't usually see them. A lot goes into the planning of the shoot. I'm obviously very weather dependent, so like my ideal weather would be sunny and cloudy, you know, a nice mixture of both. I hate it when it's overcast because you're not getting that sunlight into the shot, so a building or a cityscape will just look very flat and uninspiring. So it varies, and obviously the weather is not something, you know, it's obviously temperamental. You know, being in the UK, you're not going to, you know, one minute it'll be sunshine, and then when it comes to the day of the shoot, the weather will change. But like, right, it's going to be overcast today. A lot of planning goes into it, and obviously when the shoot does go ahead, I try to plan a whole day around it. And particularly it's harder in the winter months because obviously you're working with a lot less light, so you're having to wake up earlier to make it to, you know, whichever city you're going to make it for first light. I prefer having no people in my shots, and I will shoot, most of the time I shoot in long exposure. I tend to do what's called image stacking, so I'll take multiple long exposure shots to make one long exposure. So I try and aim to have the image to be around probably 2 to sort of 5 minutes of long exposure in total. So obviously by then you're having virtually no movement or anything at all in the image. I use a wide variety of equipment. So obviously I've got tripods, which I use particularly I prefer heavy duty tripods, because when you're packing a very heavy camera and lenses, you want to have something that's going to be sturdy enough to maintain that weight. Obviously I use filters, particularly neutral density filters, which are perfect for long exposure shots. So the exhibit is named for the exhibition is called Metropolis, and all of these, well, the images that I'm using are images that I've shot in London, and I think London is a very good example of a metropolis. But it's basically it's going to be a series of images. Some are going to be sort of more sort of cityscape based, and some are going to be sort of more close-up shots of some familiar architecture, some not so familiar. And I want to try and move away from familiar architecture, because I feel like, you know, you've seen like 1,000 interpretations of Big Ben. I want to sort of focus on buildings which people aren't too familiar with. Yeah, the theming of the project is more to do with light and how light influences a structure. So particularly like luminosity, where you've got the different sort of textures, you've got sort of like the shadows, and you've got like the highlights, and how that, you know, what do you get when you look at this image, basically. Mainly people sort of look at it and be like, wow, that's stunning, and then other people, you know, people have their own sort of interpretations of the image. But it's always been, it's definitely a personal project for me. I've always loved that sort of style of photography. Certain films like, obviously Metropolis, I love Manhattan, they've been sort of big contributors to this sort of style of photography. I've always loved shooting in black and white. I think you could do a lot more in black and white when it comes to an image in terms of how you want it to be sort of stylized. So yeah, it's more or less a project based around how luminosity sort of transcends in an image, how I like to have my images looking in terms of the lighting, the contrast, the shadows, the tones, depths, and how it sort of molds into sort of one image, but every sort of bit of the image has its own sort of characteristic theme of sort of grandeur and sort of epicness, which I see in those films. And you know, a good film sort of compared to nowadays would probably be Dune. I think they're very good examples of that sort of epicness sort of thing in a film. Yeah, and particularly some shots that I've done, they've got, you know, they're very sort of like, wow, you know, even like photographers sort of look at the image and like, wow, that's a fantastic image sort of thing. And particularly non-photographers, someone who's a non-photographer, they do sort of tend to look for, you know, something that's a wow factor to them, you know. They could have like a generic shot of the Empire State Building, but wow, that's a brilliant shot sort of thing. You know, they haven't got obviously that sort of same sort of artistic sensibilities as what we have. But I feel like with the images, you know, people sort of taking away from it will be like, wow, these have got, you know, some stunning sort of fine art images to sort of look at. And it's definitely those sort of images you sort of look at, you know, when you're looking at them, you sort of just appreciate, you know, the look of the images sort of thing. And it makes you look at buildings differently, I find. So yeah, so I think the main thing sort of taking away from the exhibition will be sort of photographers and non-photographers just to sort of appreciate the, you know, sort of the grandeur of the photos that I've sort of put into them sort of thing, whether it's from like, you know, natural taking of the image and then the post-production and how that's all sort of formed into one sort of thing. Sort of like with this like type of photography, it's been a good learning experience, because obviously the first time I did it was like back in like 2015, 2016, so I was relatively young, and there was, you know, I was only what, probably like 19 or 18, 19 at the time. So, and even then I think there was only like maybe 1 or 2 people doing this type of photography at the time. And obviously since then it's sort of not exploded, but there's a few people doing it. But obviously you want to sort of bring your own interpretation into it sort of thing. So obviously you know, you're comparing yourself to other photographers. So it's definitely a good sort of learning experience, because when I started getting back into it, I was like, wow, I've got a lot to work with sort of thing. And obviously since then, you know, post-production has changed. The stuff I have now, I didn't have, you know, 10 years ago. And it's definitely been a great project, and it's something I'm continuing, because obviously there's going to be quite a few cities I want to sort of travel to and sort of primarily do that style of photography and visit different, you know, different buildings, all that sort of stuff. Yeah, it's more of a personal project more than anything. I think when I started it at first, I was just doing it because I was like, this is, you know, the type of photography I like doing, you know, and then sort of theming sort of came about later on sort of thing. I was like, well, I've got to have a theme for this project.